Well, hi, this is John Sarver, and welcome to our GLREA Thursday evening Zoom. And thanks for coming. I'm a board member of GLREA and help out with these My Solar Stories and Thursday evening Zooms. And I know many of you are members of GLREA. Boy, if you're not, would love to have you join, support our advocacy and education efforts. We can easily do online at our website, glrea.org, glrea.org. And, I'd like to thank some of our sponsors, the State Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, Homeland Solar, McDonough and McKay, Iron Ridge Racking, Harvest Solar, and Shree Energy. And tonight, I think a very interesting discussion about nuclear power. Jeff Alson with the Alliance to Halt Fermi 3 is going to start out and talk for about 15 minutes. And then Ed Rivet with the Michigan Conservative Energy Forum is going to talk also and give us a little different perspective. Please mute yourself and hold questions and comments until we get through both presentations. And with that, let me pass it on to Jeff. Go ahead, Jeff.
Let me get to the slideshow. Okay, are you guys seeing the full slide now? Could everybody see the full slide? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Jeff Alson. I'm an engineer. I worked on carb pollution issues at the US EPA in Ann Arbor for 40 years. I see one of my old colleagues here, Craig Harvey. I'm a volunteer board member with the Alliance to Halt Fermi 3. I'm also a member of GLREA, and I appreciate the chance to be on the panel tonight. The Alliance to Halt Fermi 3 believes there are many reasons to oppose the use of nuclear power, but tonight I'm going to focus really on just one reason that I think is most relevant and compelling today, and that's that I believe nuclear power is a threat to a renewable solution to the global climate crisis. And I've got a few slides to explain my rationale for that. Just to kick it off, this is an old famous quote from the first chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, who famously said back in 1954, nuclear power will be so cheap, electricity from nuclear power will be so cheap that it will be too cheap to meter. And that was what I call the nuclear fairy tale. The nuclear reality has been 70 years later that nuclear industry has basically been a massive economic failure with zero credibility. And the following slides will explain my reasons for saying that. So there's an old saying that fool me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, shame on me. The nuclear industry has played us for suckers for decades now, and we would be idiots to ever believe them again. Now, why would I use such strong language? The simple fact is that not a single US nuclear plant has been built on budget or on time in 50 years. This is like 50 or 60 different nuclear projects now. The average nuclear plant completed in the last 50 years has cost about 2.5 times its initial cost projection and was 5 to 10 years behind its original schedule. Several, what I call nuclear white elephants, were totally abandoned after wasting billions of dollars and generating zero nuclear electricity. And unfortunately, one of the most famous examples is in our own state. In 1984, Consumers Power stopped construction of the massive nuclear project at Midland after spending over $4 billion. That would be the equivalent of about 11 or 12 billion dollars today. And it was clearly, without question, the biggest economic disaster in the state's history. Forbes Business Magazine in 1986, normally a cheerleader for big corporate projects, looked back at the previous 15 or so years of the nuclear industry and had this famous quote. It called the nuclear industry the largest managerial disaster in business history. Only the blind or the biased can now think that money has been well spent. And nothing's really changed in the last 40 years either. So going to today now, bring it up to speed. Lazard is a major engineering consulting company. Every year they issue a major report that everybody, kind of a Bible for basic economics of electricity generation. They look at all the different technologies and all the different plants that are being built and all the data and come up with estimates for what different ways to generate electricity, how much they cost. And Lazard, in their report this year, issued a couple months ago, says that new nuclear is anywhere from 2 to 6 times more expensive than new renewables. Specifically, nuclear, they project at 14. These are numbers now without distribution costs. This is just the generating cost. Nuclear would be between 14 and 22 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to utility-based renewables at 3 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, I still think this is an optimistic comparison for nuclear. It doesn't take into account the fact that the massive cost overruns seem to get bigger with each generation. I'm going to show you the latest cost overrun from the latest generation in the next slide. So I think this is an optimistic comparison. And even when you add options for firming or baseload options to account for the solar and wind intermittency, that combination of renewables and the backup firming options, non-nuclear, are still much cheaper than the nuclear option. And then from a timing standpoint, it takes, on average in the US, 15 to 20 years to go from planning a nuclear plant, designing a nuclear plant, getting the approval, building it, putting it into operation. It's typically 15 to 20 years for a large nuclear project, which basically means it's, even if you could make it cost effectively, which they can't today, but if they could, it would still be basically too slow to help to make a meaningful contribution to decarbonization goals in the 2035 or 2040 timeframe. So you might think that after this 50 years of failure that the industry would have learned some lessons to how to do things better. You would think that. Well, you would be wrong. There's been 2 major nuclear projects begun in the last 20 years. These were both begun around 2010, 2011, with very large federal subsidies. And the goal was the Department of Energy wanted to make these showcase projects to show everybody that there could be a nuclear renaissance, that they'd learn their lessons and they could do this now cost effectively and on time. 2 big projects. The first one was in South Carolina at the Summer site, 2 new reactors, $9 billion. $9 billion was spent on these reactors. They were about, I don't know, a third done. Completely abandoned in 2017. There will not be a single kilowatt hour of electricity ever from this $9 billion that was wasted. And the US Department of Justice prosecutors called it a cauldron of fraud. And several utility and industry executives have gone to prison. This was one of the 2 showcase projects to show us all that nuclear is feasible. The second one were the 2 Vogtle reactors in Georgia. You guys have probably read about this in the papers. They finally did get completed, only 7 years behind schedule, at a total cost of at least $35 billion. The $35 billion is the latest estimate, although I think there'll be one more cost accounting, so I expect it to go up a little bit more. But right now, the figure is $35 billion. They were originally projected to cost $14 billion, so it's a $21 billion cost overrun. And this cost would have been even higher, except they had a $12 billion federal loan guarantee, which allowed the Southern Company to borrow at below market rates to borrow capital. If it hadn't been for that loan guarantee, the odds are Odds are this plant would have cost close to $40 billion if they'd had to pay market prices for the investment capital. Now, just to show that the nuclear industry has a sense of humor, the Southern Company has actually been bragging about the fact that they completed these plants, which I guess is something when many utilities have been unable to complete their plants. And they've actually had these massive advertisements, I think at the Atlantic magazine, and I think even the Washington Post website for a while. But they never bothered to mention the $21 billion cost overrun, which means that their customers in Georgia will be paying much higher electricity rates for basically forever. Now, question arises, how have utilities been able to force consumers time and time again to pay for nuclear plants that have constantly and consistently overpromised and underdelivered? Well, it's a dirty little secret that politicians and state regulators don't like to talk about. And I made up the name for this. I call it the nuclear bait and switch con game. And here's how it works in Michigan. Utilities lowball the initial nuclear cost estimate to the Michigan Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission approves the nuclear project based on that lowball estimate. Utilities then spend, as I showed in earlier slides, they always spend far more on the nuclear plant than they projected to do, on average about 2.5 times. In the case of Fermi 3, our own plant in Detroit, in Monroe, it was actually much worse. I think the final bill for Fermi 3 was something like 15 times higher than the initial estimate. Then the Public Service Commission forces ratepayers that they put the money that utilities spend into the rate base. So they force ratepayers like us to pay for all, usually all, occasionally most of the cost overrun, because under the rules of the game, the way it's been set up, which is why this is a con game, the commission really can't refuse to put any of those cost overruns into the rate base unless they can prove fraud in a legal, in a court of law. And it's a very, very, very difficult threshold to prove that somebody consciously, made an overt decision that cheated the public out of this money. So typically they do approve the entire expenditures. And the massive perverse incentive in all of this is that utilities actually end up benefiting from these massive cost overruns, right? Because they basically make, under state law, being a regulated monopoly, they basically make a nominal 10%, 9.5%, 10%, whatever it is, on all their expenditures that have been approved by the State Public Service Commission. So the higher the cost of the plant, the more dollars they spend, at the end of the day, the more profit the utility makes. And they've gone to the bank with this time and time and time again. And I found this wonderful quote just in the last couple of months. This is very rare because the U.S. Department of Energy has, long been a nuclear proponent. That's part of their mission, is to promote nuclear energy. But here's this wonderful quote. He says, talking about the utilities now, their primary business model is capital expenditure. They have an inherent incentive to spend money. They make more money the more they spend. It's a beautiful summary. Sorry. So this is kind of my conclusion slide with respect to climate. Nuclear advocates, in my opinion, kind of know that they can't defend this history, so they never want to talk about it. You never see, like Midland, nobody in Michigan has talked about the Midland debacle anytime through the last year or two of talking about the energy plan and nuclear's role. Nobody mentions Midland. Nobody wants to mention this con game at the Public Service Commission. But what nuclear advocates are good at doing is hiding their motives by arguing, making this simple argument that we need to invest in any and all, or some people call it the all of the above strategy. We should just be investing in everything that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I guess just kind of hope if you invest in everything that it all kind of works out without thinking about what your specific decisions are and which ones are most cost effective and which ones make more sense to consumers and which ones just make more sense for reducing greenhouse gas emissions as fast as we want to do it. So I really just feel like that approach is a deceptive debate, a deceptive attempt to avoid debate about the very real choices that we have as citizens and as state policymakers that can have massive impacts on how quickly and how successfully we reduce greenhouse gases and our electricity rates. So this summarizes my own view of why I think nuclear threatens a sustainable, renewable climate solution. Number one, as I just said in the previous slide, utilities it's not a level playing field. Utilities will always choose nuclear when they're allowed to do it. There's no doubt about that. Secondly, nuclear is going to lead to slower and more expensive greenhouse gas reductions. New nuclear plants take 15 or 20 years. That will delay the closure of coal and natural gas plants because you got to keep them open longer until those nuclear plants are done. And they're going to be at least 2 to 6 times more expensive, probably even worse than that.
Jeff, I don't mean to interrupt, but are we on the proper screen? We're still on the nuclear bait and switch con game.
Okay, I'm sorry, I must have hit a wrong. I'm looking at the right one. Let's see if I can get back.
Try to stop sharing and then share again.
Yeah. Now are you seeing one that says all the above?
Yes.
Okay, let me get to the slideshow. Okay, sorry about that. Thirdly, nuclear will mean fewer renewable projects, not just because if you build some nuclear, you won't need as many renewables, but I think it will also reduce the number of renewable projects even independent of that, because the massive amounts of money that you're going to have to borrow to build nuclear plants is going to basically strangle the market for investment capital and make it that much harder to get the investment capital we need for wind and solar projects. If we built just 2 new nuclear plants in this state, that would be 40 or 50 or 60 billion dollars that would be unavailable for the solar and wind projects and just make those projects much more difficult to finance. And that, lastly, this is one of my recent thoughts. I'm the first one that I know of that's made this point. I think nuclear risks losing public and political support for climate programs in general. You know, it took us decades to build the political support to get the energy legislation done in Michigan a few months ago. Even when we were able to show that renewables probably wouldn't raise electricity rates at all, in some cases might even reduce electricity rates. If we build a couple nuclear plants and electricity rates start to skyrocket and we make Michigan industry less competitive because of those high electricity rates, I think we could jeopardize the political and the public support for climate programs entirely. And I think that's a major risk that people need to think about. I keep hitting a button here. Sorry about this. Just 2 more slides. This slide, geez. My keyboard is incredibly sensitive right now. Okay, finally. Here's a slide with I'm not going to be able to go in these things in any detail, but just a few of the non-climate risks that we would completely avoid if we went with a renewables focus. There's obviously radiation exposure from routine reactor operations, sporadic leaks, uranium mining. There's always the small possibility of a major accident like at Chernobyl or Fukushima. Hopefully it would never happen, but it's certainly a non-zero possibility. We haven't agreed upon a permanent solution for the storage of high-level nuclear waste. One that seems more relevant today with nuclear plants, the potential for proliferation if someone were to get the nuclear fuel, a target for terrorism or war. We've all read about the Zaporizhzhia plant in Ukraine that's been a front page news a couple times in the last couple of years in the middle of a war zone. And then one topic that very few people talk about is that nuclear has been just a magnet for fraud and for corruption. I think it's the massive amounts of money, billions, tens of billions of dollars, and the high level of secrecy and the complete lack of transparency behind these massive projects has just turned out to be a magnet for fraud. I mentioned the South Carolina debacle with people that have gone to prison. Turns out the biggest corruption case in the state of Ohio history was based on nuclear power. The Speaker of the House of the Ohio legislature took a $60 million bribe that he then used to help bribe other state legislators to support a $1.3 billion nuclear bailout in the state legislature. That House Speaker was sentenced to 20 years in prison. There's been 7 other indictments, at least 7 others. I haven't looked in the last couple of months. At least 2 suicides, including a suicide by the chair of the Public Utilities Commission, the equivalent of the Michigan Public Service Commission. The person that's supposed to be protecting the public interest was in on this bribe. My last slide, I just thought I ought to mention a little bit about Palisades plan. It's been in the news. I feel like the nuclear industry is trying to use the Palisades plant to test out just how greedy it can be. How much will it take before some politician has the backbone to step up and say enough is enough? The Palisades plant, as some of you probably know, is over 50 years old. It's a very obsolete design. Safety maintenance had been delayed for decades because the owner expected that the plant would be decommissioned. So it's in very bad shape. It was shut down completely in 2022 in a consensus agreement with the governor, the state legislature, the Public Service Commission, the NRC, environmental and consumer groups. Everybody agreed it should be shut down because it was just too costly and needed a bunch of maintenance. It was sold to a decommissioning company called Holtec that knows how to tear nuclear plants down. It doesn't know how to operate them. It can't legally operate them. And no U.S. nuclear plant has ever been reopened after being closed and having the fuel taken away. In my mind, this was just clearly a political, not a climate decision to retain a couple hundred or a few hundred high-paying jobs in the Grand Rapids area. And a great example of this, of why I think this is true, the governor issued her high-profile Michigan Healthy Climate Plan in 2022, right around the time that Palisades was being shut down. And the Palisades plant was not mentioned one time in the 100 or 200-page Healthy Climate Plan. It was clearly not part of the climate plan. And yet now we are trying to reopen it. Massive multiple subsidies. In the last 2 state budgets, $150 million each for a total of $300 million. I've spent months trying to find a single document where anybody did a study of the pros and the cons of spending this money, of whether this was the right way to spend this money compared to other alternatives. There has been no public hearings, no legislative hearings. It was all done behind closed doors, no public debate, no public discussion. There's a $1.5 billion loan guarantee from the Department of Energy for this plant. There's a 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour production tax credit if the plant is able to operate, which I doubt if it ever will, but if it does, it'll get this tax credit. And the one that is almost laughable now, it has us shaking our heads. There are rumors in the press that the Department of Agriculture, of all places, is also going to pony up nearly $1 billion. Apparently they have a pot of money that they can help rural cooperatives. And Holtec and the governor talk these rural cooperatives into buying the electricity from this Palisades plant. The electricity is way too expensive. So now the Department of Agriculture is going to step in and apparently offer up to $1 billion to the rural cooperatives to help them buy this electricity. And I can only say, what's next? what's next? They'll probably find a way to get $1 billion from the Social Security Trust Fund. That'll probably be the next step. So with that, I'll turn it back to John.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. And Ed, go ahead.
Well, that's an easy place to leap off from. Although I have to say, Jeff, I'm sort of grateful that your commentary today and your focus about the issues with the nuclear industry were not similar to many of the comments I heard a couple weeks ago when the NRC, in fact, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, was holding a public hearing regarding the Palisades reopening. It was focused specifically on environmental issues, and public comment was there, and I appreciate that your approach to it is to discuss, things that seem to be verifiable facts, as opposed to some of the crazy things that opponents of the nuclear plant came and said. And they were dramatically similar to the unhinged kind of comments I have heard at countless township and county meetings about the horrible atrocities brought about by wind turbines and solar panels. So I appreciate the fact that you didn't go into stupid land, because frankly, there were some people that showed up to testify to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's committee, and they just completely had no credibility, if I may quote you. They were saying absolutely ridiculous things. So at least in your case, you were not saying ridiculous things that lack credibility. So I will point out, however, that I don't know what the systemic reason is that the nuclear industry seems to be governed by greed and corruption. Or I won't disagree with you that our monopoly utility system is based on a perverse incentive of the more we capitalize, the more money we make. But those would be independently true, and are somewhat independently true of more than just the nuclear industry. So while I agree with you that it is equally upsetting that those are features of the nuclear industry, and they should be addressed for what they are, because they also exist in other industries. And Wall Street is full of those sorts of places. But in any case, I'll address some of the things that are important from the perspective that MISEF has in being an all of the above energy advocate. And as John Freeman and John Sarmer can both attest, MISEF is probably the leading organization in the state that works on the ground to advance the siting of large-scale wind and solar, which you're very concerned nuclear is going to undermine. So we are very much, like I say, there's not an organization that's been deeper in the fray on siting large-scale wind and solar and now battery storage. So we are all in on it. Our basis for supporting nuclear even today, while we do support the reopening of Palisades, our real emphasis is on new advanced nuclear technologies. No one should ever build another plant as South Carolina and Georgia did in the past, well, since 2010, bringing forward, because that technology, I agree, is not efficient. It's 70-year-old technology. We should not build another plant like it. So a lot of your slides, I was going, nope, you're correct. We should never do that. And we should never do that. And we should never do that, because if we can't do it better than we have historically, then we shouldn't do it. So that's kind of the perspective we bring in, is we are much more advocates for future nuclear being new nuclear technologies that have to be better on every front than the current or the old style nuclear technology. So it should never be as expensive. It should never take as long. Those features should not be part of nuclear development going forward. And I think to the extent that the industry on the whole does not have any credibility, I would say someone like Bill Gates does, because Bill Gates has done a tremendous amount of work in fighting climate change. And he has led the effort that is now the TerraPower plant, which is, again, expensive. It is not going to be anywhere near as expensive as these debacles that you've pointed out, and I don't dispute the costs of those. But I have to say that those are the ideas and technologies that we would support going forward, and that's the way it should go forward. I would also want to suggest that we compare and contrast, say, France's nuclear system with ours, because theirs doesn't appear to be as corrupt. And in fact, they do have very affordable electricity, and they're the largest exporter of electricity per resource base of anywhere in the world. And they can sell energy to their European neighbors very cheaply, because apparently they've managed to find a way not to be as corrupt and perverse in the way they've operated their industry. And we compare that with Germany, which has shut down all of its nuclear and now is over 80% driven by fossil fuel. And, you know, we can also compare countries that are have never invested in it, and we see China still building coal plants at a terrifying pace. So by contrast, and historically, while financially nuclear has not been well done, it has produced a lot of electricity. And that electricity has been exceedingly valuable. And in fact, something is necessary. Even though we are big proponents of wind and solar, electricity demand in our country is going to go through the roof, because we are the leading technological nation on industrial nation on trying to decarbonize. So we can't convert to EVs. We can't convert our buildings to electrification. And importantly, and I know some of you have been following this, we will not be able to keep up with the demand for electricity if we continue to see the expansion of data centers and AI. We have demands coming from the AI industry where they could request essentially their own nuclear plant for every maybe 2 or 3 data centers. So the projection for growth in that industry, just the growth in data centers and AI that's projected, because it's at the beginning of its explosion. AI hasn't begun to go every place they want it to go. We would need to build 70 nuclear plants over the next, whatever, dozen years or less. And that's just to keep up with their growth. And that's not converting to EVs. That's not electrifying our buildings. That's not keeping up with other increased demands for electricity. That's just to keep up with the growth in data centers. So one of the reasons you see a bipartisan political, and I won't deny what you were saying, it is a political decision, but you have Democrats and Republicans supporting, I would hope, supporting the growth in advanced new technologies that will address many of the problems that you've raised. You talked about the money being added to the budget. Don't disagree it was done in the way that you said. What I can tell you is, because there is a bipartisan nuclear caucus in the state legislature now, and it had the support of the governor, it had the support of a Democratic administration in Washington to provide the loan guarantee. That's a political will that doesn't often come together. It certainly doesn't come together as readily as we'd like it to see around other aspects of climate and clean energy. So if you want to know why things like that happen, in this case, it's because there is a strong contingent, and I wouldn't say large in the Democratic caucus, but there is a strong contingent of support for nuclear energy among Democrats in Lansing, and an almost universal support of nuclear among Republicans in Lansing. So you had the political will for these things to happen. And that's just the fact of the matter. And so there are among folks that are longtime advocates of clean energy, and they say we at least have to keep the nuclear we have, and we may need additional nuclear, preferably in the form of newer technologies, just to get close to the goals that we've set to decarbonize. So These are some of the, I would say, contextual reasons why there is what seems to be, to some folks, to be, angst that there's this attention to reopening Palisades or continuing to invest in nuclear, as if it will be a detraction from renewables. The greatest problem we have with renewables is not the capacity or the capital or the desire for it to be built. I can tell you in the work that we have done that there's 2 gigawatts of solar that should be either already built or being built right now. 2 gigawatts of solar, and it's only been held up by NIMBYs in our zoning and siting processes in the state of Michigan. Otherwise, it would be built, and there's easily could be another gigawatt in the pipeline that would be ready to go in next. So we'll be able to build those renewables, hopefully with the change in the siting law and other incentives that are coming online, including the state of Michigan just getting $129 million this week to incentivize local units of government and others to help build more large-scale renewable. But I can tell you the companies are lined up ready to build it tomorrow. And anything that would be done to invest in nuclear is not going to detract from that. There are trillions of dollars out there advancing solar technology, battery technology, even wind technology, and companies that will have access to capital to build it. So while you're saying it's a risk to renewables, from what I know of the industries and the investments that are out there, I don't see any way that it would slow it down. Far and away, the bigger threat to us not building renewables is the local environments that we've been dealing with, and I've been dealing with it explicitly in dozens and dozens of township meetings, is the resistance to just build it in the community, people turning it away. So while as I've said, and I'll also point out that while you were saying this may be a concern because it could detract from renewable building because nuclear is being viewed as a renewable investment, I can tell you nobody views nuclear as a renewable investment or per se even hardly a clean energy investment. I would say for those on the climate side of the debate, most people don't see nuclear as clean energy. They don't view it as clean. And I have good friends like Mike Booza on the call here tonight, and I think he would be the first one to say, here, we don't really see nuclear as clean energy. Likewise, proponents of nuclear who would be climate deniers or folks that just don't give a hoot about renewable energy sources, and I know many of them as a conservative and among conservative legislators in Lansing, they do not view nuclear as a renewable energy competition. They view it as almost the counter to wind and solar and renewable sources because they view it as I've lost the word and I know I've said it a million times. They view it as a dispatchable baseload form of energy that is distinctly different from what is otherwise considered renewable energy. So I would just suggest that if we're going to do nuclear, we should do it way better, way more affordably with advanced technologies. I am pretty jazzed about things like molten salt nuclear reactors as a contrast to other types, to the old style technologies. I don't necessarily see it as a threat or a competition to what we can do and what we hopefully will be doing at a much greater speed with regard to wind, solar, and battery storage. So those would be a contrasting set of opinions that I would offer.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And, let's open it up to comments and questions. If you'd like to make a comment or question, why don't you raise your virtual hand? And Dave's the first. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I just wondered what you guys think of small scale nuclear. Back in the day, there was a thought that you'd be able to have this like 4 refrigerator size unit sitting in your backyard, giving you all the power you ever wanted. Yes, and I'm laughing too.
I'll just say briefly that I just find it ironic because, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, the nuclear industry went from smaller plants to larger plants because of the economies of scale, and they thought that that would allow the plants to produce cheaper electricity. And now nuclear proponents think that they want to go from bigger plants to smaller plants because that will allow them to make cheaper electricity. It just, the history of this industry is they try something, it fails, and then there's 3 or 4 or 5 more ideas. They try those 3 or 4 or 5 ideas, they all fail, but there's another 3 or 4 or 5 ideals, right? So that's why I said at the very beginning, there's just no credibility. They've never gotten anything right, and I don't know how many times you can be wrong before we all just have to accept the fact that they're never going to be right. And I didn't bring up SMRs in my talk because there's so little real data out there, right? There's no SMRs functioning today, so there's no hard data. I'm an engineer. I like to deal with hard data, not stuff that people make believe when they're trying to sell it. And I did check into, even just in the last few years, the projects by NuScale, by GE Hitachi, and X Energy have all had their cost estimates go up by a factor of 3 or 4 times, and they're not even yet building any of them. These are increases in their own estimates as they are trying to figure out how to design them. They haven't even built one yet, and they're already seeing their price estimates go way up. And just real quick, while I got the floor, Bill Gates was mentioned by Ed. It was a great quote from Gates in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago. You know, he's invested $1 billion, but of course, him investing $1 billion is like any of us investing like, you know, $1,000 or something. So it's not that big of a deal to him. But he said it's fine for people to be skeptical about TerraPower because nuclear has failed again and again. A lot of things could go wrong. He's just throwing money at this on the possibility that it might work, you know, but the fact that he's investing in it, and that type of quote, he knows that there's no guarantee of success. He's giving it a shot, but he's not even that confident it's going to work.
Ed, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I would certainly agree that the idea that nuclear can be compartmentalized that small is just not at all practical. It's simply because of the physics, the necessity of redundancy of systems and security and all those sorts of things. You can't make it that small because there are inherent costs to all of those things. I mean, the most, and I would say successful in terms of its operational function, the most successful form of a small nuclear capacity is in our Navy. We have nuclear subs that seem to have functioned quite well for a very long time. In fact, a lot of the people who end up working in the nuclear industry in power generation are Navy veterans who learn nuclear technologies during their service in the Navy. So, but the point about the small modular concept is precisely because these large plants, the old style systems, they just don't seem to be able to build them without overruns and corruption. I don't know why that is. I would hope that Bill Gates, if he's going to invest even $1 billion, which apparently is pocket change, I thought it was a little more than pocket change to him, but the idea that he would anticipate a greater level of accountability in what's being expended and whether or not they're just, you know, part of the con game. We don't really care if we actually succeed. As long as people are gullible enough to give us money, we'll just keep playing the racket. Gates seems to be a little too bright for that. But I think he is also realistic. But I would go back to pointing to France. France is doing something right, and we're doing everything wrong. So I don't know if there's lessons to be learned.
Thanks, Ed. Keith, go ahead.
Thank you, John. And I wanted to thank GLREA for hosting this discussion. Very, very interesting. I wanted to say that Jeff covered an awful lot of ground. Thank you, Jeff. And I wanted to pick up just very quickly on the whole idea of small modular reactors. Fact of the matter is that the whole idea of small modular reactors was examined before the decision was made to begin building the full-scale reactors that we see today. And the reason for that is because they couldn't get the small reactors to work. Elk River in Minnesota being one example of that. Another point was that the nuclear industry would never, ever have been competitive at all without enormous US subsidies over decades. The so-called nuclear renaissance that we heard about for many, many years is dead. And again, the idea of small modular reactors, I think, is the latest in the smoke and mirrors campaign by the nuclear lobby, which has a firm grip on both political parties on Capitol Hill. And regarding, once again, the whole SMR question, there was the collapse of the NuScale project in Idaho, over $9 billion for 6 77 megawatt reactors. And the last point I'd like to make, and this is very, very important, with the passage of S.870 in the Senate, basically turns the Nuclear Regulatory Commission back into a promotional agency rather than a regulatory agency, and that will have serious implications for nuclear safety, environmental review, and inspections. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Andre, go ahead.
Well, when it came to nuclear, I wish you would have said more about hydrogen creation. I mean, I think that also changes the scale. The balance when you look at or consider nuclear. I think that hydrogen is a possible great fuel source. It can be clean. I've seen where they set up nuclear plants in which they take the superheated steam or either ammonia and they create hydrogen from it. And when it comes to SMRs, one of the benefits in my mind I always thought was that you can take spent fuel from another reactor and allegedly use it and have something that's not, and I'd love to hear more about it, have something that's not as reactive. So I guess I'm one of those guys that I'm like, yeah, throw everything at it. But I see there a possible future for nuclear, as looking at those two technologies.
Hey, thank you, Andre. Jim, go ahead.
My question is, let's see, am I unmuted here?
Oh, yeah, we hear you. We hear you. I can hear you, Jim.
My question is, how are we going to solve this nuclear waste problem? It dates back to the 40s and so on, when there were efforts made in Kansas to drill and put nuclear waste in the holes that were drilled, only to find that there was a water table and they contaminated the water table. So I think this is very important that we hold the companies that have the nuclear waste stacked alongside of the reactor to solve that problem before we license any more nuclear plants.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Jeff, do you want to address that, or Ed?
Well, yeah, I agree. And there are, I mean, because look, a lot of us on this call have been hearing about Yucca Mountain as a solution for about 35 years, and it never happened. And I will say, with regard to the comment, Keith's comment about the NRC becoming a cheerleader for nuclear, I can tell you one of the reasons, if you look at it historically, one of the reasons why nuclear plants take so long to build and have huge cost overruns is the NRC itself. To be perfectly honest, and maybe I sound like a small government conservative, but they're a pain in the ass. It's really damned hard to build a nuclear plant because of the NRC. And I'm going to stop there before, I go any deeper. But for every degree of corruption there is in the industry, there is a long, long list of NRC obstacles, and some of which were utterly absurd, that kept driving this cyclical change of the plant's design and process. And so it's one of the reasons why NuScale has also failed, because that was all private money, and they were sent back to the drawing board so many times that eventually it collapsed under the weight of its own, inability to get an approved design that they could then profitably or affordably build. So I don't want to see the NRC drop any of its standards for safety and security at all. But at the same time, they certainly have not done anything to help the industry be more effective or efficient in the long term. But with regard to the waste, there continues to be efforts of finding ways where they can reprocess the fuel, the spent fuel, so it doesn't need to stay in casks indefinitely. And I would agree that there is an obligation on the part of the industry to continue to figure that out, because we can't just leave it there indefinitely. There's got to be a solution.
Hey, Jeff, do you want to respond at all to the question, or?
I'm an engineer. I have no idea how you store nuclear waste for 250,000 years.
Yeah, I understand that, but you also know, Jeff, you also know that the most dangerous elements of the spent nuclear fuel can be dissipated and handled in other ways. The fact that uranium has a half-life of 14 billion years or some crazy thing like that does not mean it's going to be a danger if it's processed to a more inert status. So, but that doesn't mean that what is there has real risks. It does. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be resolved. It does. But the idea that we have to find a way to safely store nuclear waste for 10,000 years is not the reality of it either. It's a process of dealing with those isotopes and elements that are the threat, and deal with those.
I'll quickly say, I just think it's another one of those issues that why we don't have to deal with this issue. Renewables don't have any risk like that. And I just don't see why we want to mess around with billions of dollars and 20 years and thousands of years of storage and all, when we know what the solution is. Let's just get on with it.
And Jeff, can I ask you if your solution to renewables goes beyond wind and solar and storage?
Sure. Storage, hydrogen, converting the natural gas plants to use renewable hydrogen, which you can make when solar's out in California on a hot day and they've got twice as much as they need. You can be making hydrogen out of water out there and then sending that hydrogen to the converted natural gas plant. Sure, there's going to be all kinds of options. Well, let's get the 70 or 80% we know we can get from renewables, and then give us another 5 or 10 years to figure out the most cost-effective ways to get that last 10 or 20%. That's the way to go, and not commit trillions of dollars to something that's going to take you 20 years and you don't even know whether it's going to end up working or not.
Go ahead, John Freeman.
Part of the reason why I have been drawn to the renewable energy movement is not simply because we can create the electricity we need without polluting our environment, but it also is a fundamental change to the whole utility model. The utility model for the last 100 years has been a centralized top-down model, whereas Jeff pointed out that they get a 10% guarantee for everything they build. And this, as both Jeff and Ed has recognized, can definitely be an incentive for building when you don't need to build. And frankly, it's an incentive for corruption. On the other hand, renewable energy, when you give business and homeowners and farmers the ability to own their own electricity generating system. It's a decentralized model, and it takes away some of the economic clout that the utilities have. And one of the things we're dealing with in Michigan is the fact that the utilities are using their economic clout to translate it into political power to try and restrict renewable energy. And the best example, of course, is community solar. So for me, promoting nuclear energy, with all due respect to both of our speakers, seems to me it props up the centralized top-down model by the utilities, which is not the direction I think we need to go, because I want competition. I want people to have the right, and I want to take away some of the political and economic power that the utilities have.
And I'll just add on to that real quick. If Google needs, massive amounts of electricity for their data centers, let them build a nuclear plant. If they think that's the right way to go, why should I have to be paying for a new nuclear plant for their data center? They're a profit-making corporation. If they need a big amount of electricity and they want to invest in a nuclear plant, go for it. But they don't want to do that because they know that's not a cost-effective way to do it.
Hey, go ahead, Mike Buza.
Yeah, I apologize for coming in late, and if you have addressed this issue, sorry about that. But we've got a relatively short time frame to deal with global warming and putting things up, and developing nuclear plants seem to take a very long time frame. How would you address that issue, Ed?
Well, again, and I think I said it at one point that the old style nuclear plants, which I don't disagree with Jeff, do take a long time. That's not an acceptable path forward. I would not advocate for building another Vogel or any kind of plant that's of the old style technology in that scale, the massive plant, et cetera. If we're not going to be able to bring forward more affordable and brought more quickly online, then we shouldn't do it. I would never advocate for building another traditional style nuclear plant. So that's just part of the reality that it's got to do its thing. I mean, and I agree with Andre. I'm a big fan of hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells, but we would have to spend billions and trillions, perhaps, of dollars if we were to build out the infrastructure in a similar fashion that we have built out either gasoline for our vehicles or pipelines for natural gas and so forth, to take that hydrogen that we're going to create in California and move it around and make it accessible and build a whole new infrastructure for hydrogen. That costs a massive amount of money. Now, I would prefer perhaps that they spend it on that than a lot of other things that they might spend it on in the energy world. But some of the alternatives are equally expensive. Many of them have come along and proven to be boondoggles. You can't convince the average American that they want to buy an EV right now, because we have to get rid of liquid lithium ion batteries that catch on fire and cost, take 10,000 gallons of water to try and put them out. They don't want to buy those cars because they think that the current EV batteries are a debacle. Billions of dollars in government subsidies, and Joe Biden is screwing us over and blah, 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 because they think that those batteries are a joke right now. There's no place to charge them, et cetera, et cetera. And Washington is pumping out all these billions and billions of dollars for all these subsidies for cars that we don't. I'm only doing this diatribe to say that everything Jeff characterized the nuclear industry about, maybe in a much bigger scale of corruption and fraud and everything else. But there are people who view the technologies that we know are going to be replaced in 2 and 3 and 5 years. They're talking about the solar panels that, from 10 or 15 years ago, which were terribly inefficient compared to today's. But they view these same sort of investments and stuff as boondoggles as well. So sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder where a technology is and what its potential is. But I also agree more with John Freeman that the more we change people's capacity to invest and own their own generation, the more we will eventually break down the centralized model of our monopoly utilities.
Yeah. Andre, you get the last question. Go ahead, Andre.
So, and I'm kind of going off beat with this. So with hydrogen and fuel cells, I think that's a great technology. But as far as being in cars, I don't think that is the first thing. And I've always said this. Initially, I think that it should be used as peaker units to help support the system when the grid is going low. And with that, you develop other safety and other things, handling practices for hydrogen. You know, the technology will grow with it. And then from that, you could take it and put it in dynamic systems, I think. I just don't think that we have the experience of hydrogen handling right now, I guess. In my mind, that's always.
Yeah, actually, I think I'll take the last question. And I don't know if Jeff or Ed, you know, I know that, you know, Ontario has quite a bit of nuclear power, and I haven't heard of any kind of big problems or issues there. I wonder if either of you are familiar with the Ontario experience. You know, Ed mentioned France, but Ontario is just real close. And I know they have a decent amount of nuclear power, and they haven't seemed to have had the same sort of issues. But of course, it may be ignorance on my part. Either of you familiar with Ontario's experience? Okay.
Not enough to speak to it.
Okay.
Because Canada also has a tremendous amount of efficient hydroelectric power. And frankly, if we could run a nice big extension cord from Ontario, either through the Soo or through Windsor or Port Huron, there's some big juice over there. And if we got a nice high voltage DC line across from some of their hydro, we could get some cheap electricity from our Canadian neighbors.
That would be very nice. Well, it's after 8 o'clock, and thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Ed. This has been a great discussion. And thank you for all the participants for making comments and asking questions. And yeah, again, I think I'm glad that GLREA went ahead and kind of hosted this discussion, because I think it's been very informative. So hey, thanks,
John. John, I want to interrupt before most of the crowd disappears. There was a reference at the beginning when John Freeman said, "Hey, I'm going to send that thing to you, Ed, tomorrow," and I'm going to give you a little preview in that. John and I spoke. I am overseeing a grant here in the state of Michigan to boost large-scale wind and solar siting. And part of my task is to tap into networks and organizations of like-minded people who would be willing to help us overcome the challenges that we have in local communities. And so in kind of quarterbacking this project, I'm reaching out to organizations. So I've reached out to John. He's going to be sending in a grant application. I hope it's going to come together so that GLREA is going to get a little pot of money. And he's going to in turn reach out to all of you and ask you to become trained and willing foot soldiers, perhaps to help us advance large-scale wind and solar across the state in your communities, whether that's efforts where there's an actual project being discussed and ordinance and permitting and all that, or whether it's just public education, you know, tabling at a fair or a festival in your community. I hope that's something that comes together. John and I will continue to have that discussion in having GLREA partner with us. But if that does come together, we'll be asking all of you to be signed up recruits and work with us to help get that large scale wind and solar built.
Hey, thanks, Ed, for sharing that, because that sounds like it's going to be a good opportunity potentially to kind of help out, because you know, there's a lot going on at the local level with respect to siting solar and wind farms. So thanks for bringing that up. And thanks to everybody for coming tonight. And, you know, like I said, thanks particularly to Jeff and Ed for making the presentation and answering lots of questions. So take care, everybody.
Thanks, John.